I really like the stories of Kate Chopin, but I knew next to nothing about her until I did some reading for this video. I was surprised. I'd assumed she was a pretty modern writer, but she actually lived almost exactly in the second half of the 19th century, from 1851 to 1904. She was American, of French-Irish descent, a Roman Catholic, spoke French as well as English, and lived in Missouri and Louisiana. And most of her stories record the Creole culture of Louisiana at the time. She's one of those writers that everybody says was way ahead of her time, and in her case it's absolutely true. She's especially notable for the way she describes and celebrates female strength, will, passion, purpose, independence, puts her way ahead of more than one politician or writer of our own day. Her style is also really modern. It's clean, it's spare, it's unornamented, it relies on deft psychological strokes instead of all that 19th century fluff. Which also means that her stories are quite short, so we get to do a selection of them today. And I'm going to start not with her very best stories, but with two of the funny ones that I think, because they're quite simple, they highlight her style really well. Starting with A Respectable Woman. Mrs. Baroda was a little provoked to learn that her husband expected his friend Gouvernail, I really hope I'm pronouncing that name right, up to spend a week or two on the plantation. They had entertained a good deal during the winter. Much of the time had also been passed in New Orleans in various forms of mild dissipation. She was looking forward to a period of unbroken rest now, an undisturbed tete-a-tete with her husband, when he informed her that Gouvernail was coming up to stay a week or two. This was a man she had heard much of, but never seen. He had been her husband's college friend, was now a journalist, and in no sense a society man or a man about town, which were perhaps some of the reasons she had never met him. But she had unconsciously formed an image of him in her mind. She pictured him tall, slim, cynical, with eyeglasses and his hands in his pockets, and she did not like him. Gouvernail was slim enough, but he wasn't very tall nor very cynical. Neither did he wear eyeglasses nor carry his hands in his pockets, and she rather liked him when he first presented himself. But why she liked him, she could not explain satisfactorily to herself when she partly attempted to do so. She could discover in him none of those brilliant and promising traits which Gaston, her husband, had so often assured her he possessed. On the contrary, he sat rather mute and receptive before her chatty eagerness to make him feel at home, and in face of Gaston's frank and wordy hospitality. His manner was as courteous toward her as the most exacting woman could require, but he made no direct appeal to her approval or even esteem. Once settled at the plantation, he seemed to like to sit upon the wide portico in the shade of one of the big Corinthian pillars, smoking his cigar lazily and listening attentively to Gaston's experience as a sugar planter. "This is what I call living," he would utter with deep satisfaction as the air that swept across the sugar field caressed him with its warm and scented velvety touch. It pleased him also to get on familiar terms with the big dogs that came about him, rubbing themselves socially about his legs. He did not care to fish, and displayed no eagerness to go out and kill grosbecs when Gaston proposed doing so. Gouvernail's personality puzzled Mrs. Baroda, but she liked him. Indeed, he was a lovable, inoffensive fellow. After a few days, when she could understand him no better than at first, she gave over being puzzled and remained piqued. In this mood, she left her husband and her guest for the most part alone together. Then, finding that Gouvernail took no manner of exception to her action, she imposed her society upon him, accompanying him in his idle strolls to the mill and walks along the batture. She persistently sought to penetrate the reserve in which he had unconsciously enveloped himself. "Where is he going, your friend?" she one day asked her husband. "For my part, he tires me frightfully." "Not for a week yet, my dear. I can't understand. He gives you no trouble." "No, I should like him better if he did, if he were more like others, and I had to plan somewhat for his comfort and enjoyment." Gaston took his wife's pretty face between his hands and looked tenderly and laughingly into her troubled eyes. They were making a bit of toilet sociably together in Mrs. Baroda's dressing room. "You are full of surprises, ma belle," he said to her. "Even I can never count upon how you are going to act under given conditions." He kissed her and turned to fasten his cravat before the mirror. "Here you are," he went on, "taking poor Gouvernail seriously and making a commotion over him, the last thing he would desire or expect." "Commotion?" she hotly resented. "Nonsense! How can you say such a thing? Commotion, indeed! But you know you said he was clever." "So he is. But the poor fellow is run down by overwork now. That's why I asked him here to take a rest." "You used to say he was a man of ideas," she retorted, unconciliated. "I expected him to be interesting, at least. I'm going to the city in the morning to have my spring gowns fitted. Let me know when Mr. Gouvernail is gone. I shall be at my Aunt Octavie's." That night she went and sat alone upon a bench that stood beneath a live oak tree at the edge of the gravel walk. She had never known her thoughts or her intentions to be so confused. She could gather nothing from them but the feeling of a distinct necessity to quit her home in the morning. Mrs. Baroda heard footsteps crunching the gravel, but could discern in the darkness only the approaching red point of a lighted cigar. She knew it was Gouvernail, for her husband did not smoke. She hoped to remain unnoticed, but her white gown revealed her to him. He threw away his cigar and seated himself on the bench beside her, without a suspicion that she might object to his presence. "Your husband told me to bring this to you, Mrs. Baroda," he said, handing her a flimsy white scarf with which she sometimes enveloped her head and shoulders. She accepted the scarf from him with a murmur of thanks and let it lie in her lap. He made some commonplace observation upon the baneful effect of the night air at the season. Then, as his gaze reached out into the darkness, he murmured, half to himself, "Night of south winds, night of the few large stars, still nodding night." She made no reply to this apostrophe to the night, which indeed was not addressed to her. Gouvernail was in no sense a diffident man, for he was not a self-conscious one. His periods of reserve were not constitutional, but the result of moods. Sitting there beside Mrs. Baroda, his silence melted for the time. He talked freely and intimately, in a low, hesitating drawl that was not unpleasant to hear. He talked of the old college days when he and Gaston had been a good deal to each other, of the days of keen and blind ambitions and large intentions. Now there was left with him at least a philosophic acquiescence to the existing order, only a desire to be permitted to exist with now and then a little whiff of genuine life, such as he was breathing now. Her mind only vaguely grasped what he was saying. Her physical being was for the moment predominant. She wasn't thinking of his words, only drinking in the tones of his voice. She wanted to reach out her hand in the darkness and touch him with the sensitive tips of her fingers upon the face or the lips. She wanted to draw close to him and whisper against his cheek. She did not care what, as she might have done if she had not been a respectable woman. The stronger the impulse grew to bring herself near him, the further, in fact, did she draw away from him. As soon as she could do so without an appearance of too great rudeness, she rose and left him there alone. Before she reached the house, Gouvernail had lighted a fresh cigar and ended his apostrophe to the night. Mrs. Baroda was greatly tempted that night to tell her husband, who was also her friend, of this folly that had seized her. But she did not yield to the temptation. Beside being a respectable woman, she was a very sensible one, and she knew there are some battles in life which a human being must fight alone. When Gaston arose in the morning, his wife had already departed. She had taken an early morning train to the city. She did not return till Gouvernail was gone from under her roof. There was some talk of having him back during the summer that followed. That is, Gaston greatly desired it, but this desire yielded to his wife's strenuous opposition. However, before the year ended, she proposed wholly from herself to have Gouvernail visit them again. Her husband was surprised and delighted with the suggestion coming from her. "I am glad, chère amie, that you have finally overcome your dislike for him. Truly, he did not deserve it." "Oh," she said laughingly, after pressing a long, tender kiss upon his lips, "I've overcome everything. You'll see. This time I shall be very nice to him." Well, like I said, a really funny story, and what I really admire is how compact a story it is, almost like it was concentrated and you just needed to add water. It's a small number of pages when you read it, but let it roll around in your brain for a few days, and every word, every phrase suddenly has pages and pages behind it. And another story like that, also funny, much more cynical, is The Kiss. It was still quite light out of doors, but inside, with the curtains drawn and the smoldering fire sending out a dim, uncertain glow, the room was full of deep shadows. Brantain sat in one of these shadows. It had overtaken him, and he did not mind. The obscurity lent him courage to keep his eyes fastened as ardently as he liked upon the girl who sat in the firelight. She was very handsome, with a certain fine, rich coloring that belongs to the healthy brune type. She was quite composed as she idly stroked the satiny coat of the cat that lay curled on her lap, and she occasionally sent a slow glance into the shadow where her companion sat. They were talking low of indifferent things, which plainly were not the things that occupied their thoughts. She knew that he loved her, a frank, blustering fellow without guile enough to conceal his feelings and no desire to do so. For 2 weeks past he had sought her society eagerly and persistently. She was confidently waiting for him to declare himself, and she meant to accept him. The rather insignificant and unattractive Brantain was enormously rich, and she liked and required the entourage which wealth could give her. During one of the pauses between their talk of the last tea and the next reception, the door opened and a young man entered whom Brantain knew quite well. The girl turned her face toward him. A stride or two brought him to her side, and bending over her chair before she could suspect his intention, for she did not realize that he had not seen her visitor, he pressed an ardent, lingering kiss upon her lips. Brantain slowly arose. So did the girl arise, but quickly, and the newcomer stood between them, a little amusement and some defiance struggling with the confusion in his face. "I believe," stammered Brantain, "I see that I've stayed too long. I had no idea. That is, I must wish you goodbye." He was clutching his hat with both hands, and probably did not perceive that she was extending her hand to him. Her presence of mind had not completely deserted her, but she could not have trusted herself to speak. "Hang me if I saw him sitting there, Natty. I know it's deuced awkward for you, but I hope you'll forgive me this once, this very first break." "Why, what's the matter?" "Don't touch me, don't come near me," she returned angrily. "What do you mean by entering the house without ringing?" "I came in with your brother, as I often do," he answered coldly in self-justification. "We came in the side way. He went upstairs, and I came in here, hoping to find you. The explanation is simple enough and ought to satisfy you that the misadventure was unavoidable." "But do say you forgive me, Natalie," he entreated, softening. "Forgive you? You don't know what you're talking about. Let me pass. It depends upon a good deal whether I ever forgive you." At that next reception which she and Brantain had been talking about, she approached the young man with a delicious frankness of manner when she saw him there. "Will you let me speak to you a moment or two, Mr. Brantain?" she asked with an engaging but perturbed smile. He seemed extremely unhappy, but when she took his arm and walked away with him, seeking a retired corner, a ray of hope mingled with the almost comical misery of his expression. She was apparently very outspoken. "Perhaps I should not have sought this interview, Mr. Brantain, but I have been very uncomfortable, almost miserable since that little encounter the other afternoon, when I thought how you might have misinterpreted it and believed things." Hope was plainly gaining the ascendancy over misery in Brantain's round, guileless face. "Of course I know it is nothing to you, but for my own sake I do want you to understand that Mr. Harvey is an intimate friend of long standing. Why, we've always been like cousins, like brother and sister, I may say. He's my brother's most intimate associate, and often fancies he's entitled to the same privileges as the family. Oh, I know it is absurd, uncalled for to tell you this, undignified even." She was almost weeping. "But it makes so much difference to me what you think of me." Her voice had grown very low and agitated. The misery had all but disappeared from Brantain's face. "Then you really do care what I think, Miss Natalie? May I call you Miss Natalie?" They turned into a long, dim corridor that was lined on either side with tall, graceful plants. They walked slowly to the very end of it. When they turned to retrace their steps, Brantain's face was radiant and hers was triumphant. Harvey was among the guests at the wedding, and he sought her out in a rare moment when she stood alone. "Your husband," he said, smiling, "has sent me over to kiss you." A quick blush suffused her face and round, polished throat. "I suppose it's natural for a man to feel and act generously on occasions of this kind. He tells me that he doesn't want this marriage to interrupt wholly that pleasant intimacy which has existed between you and me. I don't know what you've been telling him," with an insolent smile, "but he has sent me here to kiss you." She felt like a chess player who, by the clever handling of his pieces, sees the game taking the course intended. Her eyes were bright and tender, with a smile as they glanced up in his, and her lips looked hungry for the kiss which they invited. "But you know," he went on quietly, "I didn't tell him so. It would have seemed ungrateful, but I can tell you, I've stopped kissing women. It's dangerous." Well, she had Brantain and his millions left. A person can't have everything in this world, and it was a little unreasonable of her to expect it. Wonderfully funny and cynical story, and if some of it now feels very outdated, the dumb old stereotype of the scheming, manipulative bride-to-be, I think what's really striking and modern is the light touch she applies, the way she's showing you these three imperfect but not monstrous human creatures and not taking sides for or against any of them. And I think we'll see the same thing in the next story, even though it treats a very different topic. If you'd just read those first two stories, you might think Kate Chopin just writes about lovers and kissing and relationships and so on, and she's very good at that, but she can apply that same psychological depth and insightful observation to very different topics, such as here in A Pair of Silk Stockings. Little Mrs. Summers one day found herself the unexpected possessor of $15. It seemed to her a very large amount of money, and the way in which it stuffed and bulged her worn old porte-monnaie gave her a feeling of importance such as she had not enjoyed in years. The question of investment was one that occupied her greatly. For a day or two she walked about, apparently in a dreamy state, but really absorbed in speculation and calculation. She did not wish to act hastily, to do anything that she might afterwards regret. But it was during the still hours of the night when she lay awake revolving plans in her eyes that she seemed to see her way clearly toward a proper and judicious use of the money. $1 or two should be added to the price usually paid for Janie's shoes, which would ensure their lasting an appreciable time longer than they usually did. She would buy so and so many yards of percale for new shirtwaists for the boys and Janie and Mag. She had intended to make the old ones do by skillful patching. Mag should have another gown. She had seen some beautiful patterns, veritable bargains in the shop windows, and there would be enough left for new stockings, 2 pairs apiece, and what darning that would save for a while. She would get caps for the boys and sailor hats for the girls. The vision of her little brood looking fresh and dainty and new for once in their lives excited her and made her restless and wakeful with anticipation. The neighbors sometimes talked of certain better days that little Mrs. Summers had known before she had ever thought of being Mrs. Summers. She herself indulged in no such morbid retrospection. She had no time, no second of time to devote to the past. The needs of the present absorbed her every faculty. A vision of the future, like some dim, gaunt monster, sometimes appalled her, but luckily tomorrow never comes. Mrs. Summers was one who knew the value of bargains, who could stand for hours making her way inch by inch toward the desired object that was selling below cost. She could elbow her way if need be. She had learned to clutch a piece of goods and hold it and stick to it with persistence and determination till her turn came to be served, no matter when it came. But that day she felt a little faint and tired. She had swallowed a light luncheon. No, when she came to think of it, between getting the children fed and the place righted and preparing herself for the shopping about, she had actually forgotten to eat any luncheon at all. She sat herself upon a revolving stool before a counter that was comparatively deserted, trying to gather strength and courage to charge through an eager multitude that was besieging breastworks of shirting and figured lawn. An all-gone limp feeling had come over her, and she rested her hand aimlessly on the counter. She wore no gloves. By degrees, she became aware that her hand had encountered something very soothing, very pleasant to touch. She looked down to see that her hand lay upon a pile of silk stockings. A placard nearby announced that they had been reduced in price from $2.50 to $1.98, and a young girl who stood beside the counter asked her if she wished to examine their line of silk hosiery. She smiled, just as if she had been asked to inspect a tiara of diamonds with the ultimate view of purchasing it. But she went on feeling the soft, sheeny, luxurious things, with both hands now, holding them up to see them glisten and to feel them glide serpent-like through her fingers. 2 hectic blotches came suddenly into her pale cheeks. She looked up at the girl. "Do you think there are any 8.5s among these?" There were any number of 8.5. In fact, there were more of that size than any other. Here was a light blue pair, there were some lavenders, some all black and various shades of tan and gray. Mrs. Summers selected a black pair and looked at them very long and closely. She pretended to be examining their texture, which the clerk assured her was excellent. $1.98, she mused aloud. Well, I'll take this pair. She handed the girl a $5 bill and waited for her change and for her parcel. What a very small parcel it was. It seemed lost in the depths of her shabby old shopping bag. Mrs. Summers, after that, did not move in the direction of the bargain counter. She took the elevator, which carried her to an upper floor into the region of the ladies' waiting rooms. Here, in a retired corner, she exchanged her cotton stockings for the new silk ones which she had just bought. She was not going through any acute mental process or reasoning with herself, nor was she striving to explain to her satisfaction the motive of her action. She was not thinking at all. She seemed for a time to be taking a rest from that laborious and fatiguing function, and to have abandoned herself to some mechanical impulse that directed her actions and freed her of responsibility. How good was the touch of the raw silk to her flesh! She felt like lying back in the cushioned chair and reveling for a while in the luxury of it. She did for a little while. Then she replaced her shoes, rolled the cotton stockings together, and thrust them into her bag. After doing this, she crossed straight over into the shoe department and took her seat to be fitted. She was fastidious. The clerk could not make her out. He could not reconcile her shoes with her stockings, and she was not too easily pleased. She held back her skirts and turned her feet one way and her head another way as she glanced down at the polished, pointy-tipped boots. Her foot and ankle looked very pretty. She could not realize that they belonged to her and were a part of herself. She wanted an excellent and stylish fit, she told the young fellow who served her, and she did not mind the difference of $1 or $2 more in the price, so long as she got what she desired. It was a long time since Mrs. Summers had been fitted with gloves. On rare occasions, when she had bought a pair, they were always bargains, so cheap that it would have been preposterous and unreasonable to have expected them to be fitted to the hand. Now she rested her elbow on the cushion of the glove counter, and a pretty pleasant young creature, delicate and deft of touch, drew a long-wristed kid over Mrs. Summers's hand. She smoothed it down over the wrist and buttoned it neatly, and both lost themselves for a second or two in admiring contemplation of the little symmetrical gloved hand. But there were other places where money might be spent. There were books and magazines piled up in the window of a stall a few paces down the street. Mrs. Summers bought 2 high-priced magazines, such as she had been accustomed to read in the days when she had been accustomed to other pleasant things. She carried them without wrapping. As well as she could, she lifted her skirts at the crossings. Her stockings and boots and well-fitting gloves had worked marvels in her bearing, had given her a feeling of assurance, a sense of belonging to the well-dressed multitude. She was very hungry. Another time she would have stilled the cravings for food until reaching her own home, where she would have brewed herself a cup of tea and taken a snack of anything that was available. But the impulse that was guiding her would not suffer her to entertain any such thought. There was a restaurant at the corner. She had never entered its doors. From the outside she had sometimes caught glimpses of spotless damask and shining crystal and soft-stepping waiters serving people of fashion. When she entered, her appearance created no surprise, no consternation, as she had half feared it might. She seated herself at a small table alone, and an attentive waiter at once approached to take her order. She did not want a profusion. She craved a nice and tasty bite, a half-dozen blue points, a plump chop with cress, something sweet, a creme frappée, for instance, a glass of Rhine wine, and after all, a small cup of black coffee. While waiting to be served, she removed her gloves very leisurely and laid them beside her. Then she picked up a magazine and glanced through it, cutting the pages with the blunt edge of her knife. It was all very agreeable. The damask was even more spotless than it had seemed through the window, and the crystal more sparkling. There were quiet ladies and gentlemen who did not notice her, lunching at the small tables like her own. A soft, pleasing strain of music could be heard, and a gentle breeze was blowing through the window. She tasted a bite and read a word or two, and she sipped the amber wine and wiggled her toes in the silk stockings. The price of it made no difference. She counted the money out to the waiter and left an extra coin on the tray, whereupon he bowed before her as before a princess of royal blood. There was still money in her purse, and her next temptation presented itself in the shape of a matinee poster. It was a little later when she entered the theater. The play had begun, and the house seemed to her to be packed. But there were vacant seats here and there, and into one of them she was ushered, between brilliantly dressed women who had gone there to kill time and eat candy and display their gaudy attire. There were many others who were there solely for the play and acting. It's quite safe to say there was no one present who bore quite the attitude which Mrs. Summers did to her surroundings. She gathered in the whole, stage and players and people, in one wide impression, and absorbed it and enjoyed it. She laughed at the comedy and wept. She and the gaudy woman next to her wept over the tragedy, and they talked together a little over it, and the gaudy woman wiped her eyes and snuffled on a tiny square of filmy, perfumed lace and passed little Mrs. Summers her box of candy. The play was over, the music ceased, the crowd filed out. It was like a dream ended. People scattered in all directions. Mrs. Summers went to the corner and waited for the cable car. A man with keen eyes who sat opposite to her seemed to like the study of her small, pale face. It puzzled him to decipher what he saw there. In truth, he saw nothing, unless he were wizard enough to detect a poignant wish, a powerful longing that the cable car would never stop anywhere, but go on and on with her forever. Two things I love about that story. One is that the happiness of it and the sadness of it are so intermingled. It really is impossible to tell where the one leaves off and the other starts. And the other is that there are writers who, when you imbibe their works, you really feel like you're getting to know them as a person, their personality, their lived experiences, and really get that impression out of this that Kate Chopin knew both what it was like to be very comfortable or outright rich, and also what it was like to be poor. And even today it's true, although the luckier part of the middle class miss it, and there's a whole political party here in the UK intent on denying it, but nobody works harder or longer than the less well off. It's a full-time job being poor, and the demands on one's time are every bit as atrocious as the demands on one's pocketbook. And now I'll read another story in a similar vein, not quite as psychologically profound as the last one, but super sweet. This is With the Violin. And he over the mantelpiece with big black eyes and such long black hair and a violin. Is he your brother too, Papa Conrad? And why do you keep a green branch always hanging over his picture? No, that is not my brother, Sophie. That is an angel whom the good God allowed once to save a poor, desperate human being from sin and death. But where are his wings, Papa Conrad? I never saw an angel look like that, and so black, too. There are some angels without wings, little Griselle. Not many, I admit, but I have known a few. Tell us how he saved the poor, desperate man, Papa Conrad. Well, Sophie, if you'll brush up the hearth like a good little housewife, and Ernst, throw some coals on the fire, and little Griselle, come here, sit on my knee, and I will try to tell the story. It happened a good many weary years ago, as you little ones count them. As many years, I suppose, as Ernst has been living in the world. How old are you, Ernst? 10 years old, going on 11. That it was before your time, for it happened just 12 years ago tonight. My, but that was a cold night. Colder than it is tonight, Papa Conrad. Oh, far, far colder. There was no snow on the ground as there is tonight, but the air seemed filtered through ice. People hurried from one shop to another to keep away the cold, and the coachmen driving their fine carriages were wrapped in great furs till only their eyes peeped out. All the shops were ablaze, but there were not many on such a night willing to stand and look into their windows. Yet there stood the poor devil I'm going to tell you about, looking into a jeweler's big showcase where the workmen had just laid aside their tools. Those watchmenders whom you've seen wearing a big round glass in one eye, you know. That's what you are, a watchmender, isn't it, Papa Conrad? To be sure, Sophie. Well, he had been inside asking for work, and there was none for him. He had said to himself before going in, "This shall be my last trial." So now he stood looking absently in at the window, the frozen air penetrating his body, for his clothes were thin and few. He was hungry and very, very miserable. Only think, he was in a strange city, without friends and without work and with no money. He still had a little room away up in the top story of a very high, rickety old building. How high was the building, Papa Conrad? I bet not so high as the little windows of the cathedral steeple. No, Ernst, not so high, but quite high enough that when he reached the top he was faint and exhausted from mounting the stairs. I believe that little room was colder than outdoors. At any rate, it was more cheerless. Another lump of coal on the fire, Ernst. That's a fine boy, and how strong! Little Griselle is not sleeping? That's well. The broken windows were rattling in their loose casings, and the bitter cold was sweeping in gusts down the bleak chimney, through the empty fireplace and into the room. He went in and sat right down, for he had no greatcoat to stop and take off, you know. He spread his arms out on the table, and he stared blankly before him through the window, into the darkness. But I think he saw nothing save his own heart that was sore and tired. It did not care to beat any longer and keep him alive. It seemed to him as if the world had pushed him aside, as if mankind had shut him out from a share in their common existence and left him alone with a misery that he could no longer bear. The truth is, he wanted to die, and he was so reckless he never thought if the good God wanted him to go or not before he was called. He just wanted to die, and he had something in his pocket that was going to help him end his unhappy life. I know, it was a pistol, and he was going to shoot himself. No, Ernst, it was not a pistol. He had none, nor money to buy one either. It was only a little white deadly powder. On the mantel shelf there was a cracked teacup and an end of a candle which he lighted. He wiped out the cup, for it was dusty, and he wanted that his poison be clean at least, and in it he emptied the powder. Then he went to the pitcher to get water to pour on, but the water was all frozen through and through. However, a little thing like that was not going to stop him. He took a rusty poker, held it in the flame of the candle till it was pretty hot, and with it he melted a little of the ice at a time till he had what water he needed. Never mind the poker, Ernst, put it down. We don't want to heat that one, and you scatter the ashes that Sophie just swept so nicely. Well, he went back to the table and seated himself, this time with the cup before him, and he closed his eyes a moment, not hesitatingly, only while he might bid goodbye to life, as it were. And as he sat thus, there suddenly broke upon the stillness a long, low wail, like the voice of a soul that begs. Oh, but it was soft and exquisite, and it sent a quiver through the frame of the poor wretch who heard it. The sweetness of the sound seemed to swell and grow broader till it filled the little room with melody such as you never heard in your lives, children. Such a blending of tones, pleading, chiding, singing out in the night. He sat at the table spellbound, now with wide open eyes, for he was no longer in his cold, bleak room. His blood tingled with a genial warmth. Hundreds of lights were blazing. He was a boy again, happy of heart, seated between father and mother in a grand theatre, and listening to the same wonderful music that came to him now. Ah, that would have been a moment to die in. But this enchanting voice had made him forget that he wanted to die. It had brought youth and love and trust back to his old heart. Papa Conrad, it must have been the angels singing on Christmas Eve. That is what the poor creature thought at first himself, Sophie. What he did was to get up and dash his cup of poison into the empty fireplace. Then he fell on his knees and wept and thanked the good God who had chosen this way to speak to him. When he arose, he crept close to the door to listen, for those heavenly sounds were coming from the next room. When the music had ended, I'm sure I don't know how he found courage to do it, he rapped gently on the door. Wasn't he afraid, Papa Conrad? Suppose it had been real angels. Oh, my! Well, he knew it wasn't such angels as we see in the picture books, Ernst. When he knocked a second time, the door opened, and there stood the young man whose picture you see hanging over the mantelpiece. Standing just that way, with his violin under his arm, his long black hair hanging over his forehead, and his dark eyes full of kindness. He looked puzzled at first, then threw the door wide open and drew the unhappy man into his room. A lamp was burning brightly, and there was a good fire in the grate. Not such a fine one, to be sure, as Ernst has been making us, but it was like the glow of warm sunlight to the desolate old man. The young musician said nothing, but drew his chair up and looked fixedly at his strange guest. Then he arose, went to the cupboard, and brought out a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a bottle of beer. And butter and jam, Papa Conrad? No, Gricelle, I'm afraid there was neither butter nor jam, but I'm sure it tasted like nectar and ambrosia. Let me think to tell you about nectar and ambrosia at our little talk next Sunday. Before the poor devil went to bed that night, he had told everything to the young violin player, and from that moment he never wanted for a friend again. That was a grand, rich young man, wasn't he? And he gave the poor old man plenty of money? No, he wasn't rich, Ernst. He had only a little himself, but that little he shared with the other till the darkness was past. If we only have patience to wait through the night, children, be sure that day will break at the close of it. Where's the young man now, Papa Conrad? Is he dead, and has he got real wings on in heaven? Oh, no, Sophie, thank God he isn't dead. He's coming to eat his Christmas dinner with me tomorrow. But I thought that Herr Ludwig, the great leader of the opera, was coming to eat dinner with you, and that was why you were going to have such a grand dinner, and he said we might come in and have coffee and cake afterwards. Ah, to be sure, to be sure. Papa Conrad's getting old and forgets things. I hear the mother calling. Maybe Santa Claus has come and lighted the Christmas tree. Now I think we can go on to what's arguably her best and most celebrated story. And funny thing about this was my first encounter with Kate Chopin, and it was in a standardized test in high school. Kate Chopin is very popular in American English tests because the stories are short and easy to follow up with essay questions like, how does the author employ dramatic irony to develop her theme? And then you imagine millions of bored California high school students writing, since the beginning of history, authors have always used irony. And I remember being just a little bit cross because I really, really liked the story and wanted the time to sit down and enjoy it properly. And instead I had an essay to write for a test. But we have all the time we want now, so let's enjoy this one at our own pace. The dream of an hour. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. It was her sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. Her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. But she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free. 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 The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and grey and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have the right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet she had loved him, sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free. Body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was leaning before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I am not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in the very elixir of life through that open window. How fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long, and now what a change! She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like the goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard, who entered, a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident, and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife, who just then looked up. But Richard was too late. When the doctors came, they said that she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. I don't think there's anything to say by way of interpretation or explanation of that story. I'll only add one thing that I read quite recently, which was that she wrote it 4 years after being widowed herself, which really makes one wonder. She appears not to have been happy about having been widowed. Wikipedia at least says she went into a long depression. But you kind of wonder if maybe she wrote this story in part to recognize the silver lining of what she had gotten for herself after that long period of depression. There's this wonderful phrase that she uses, and it's so striking that it can't be accidental, this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being. What a beautiful way to put that. And she's valuing that more than love, than kindness, than constancy, than, all the greatest treasures this life has to offer. Still, it's dangerous to read too much into an author's story about their life. She could have been writing about a friend. It could have been pure imagination. There's probably no knowing now. So I'd like to recommend 2 stories of hers that I'm not going to read today. And the first one is Desiree's Baby. I've been skipping some stories of hers that reflect the time she lived in maybe a little too well. The South of the late 19th century was atrocious as far as prejudice, discrimination, the outright crimes and murders that were going on. And while Kate Chopin was, again, ahead of her times in many ways and really talked about a lot of those cruelties, she also is a product of her time and sometimes writes about people of color in this not disparaging but patronizing way, which whatever you think about judging the past by the standards of the present, at least really makes those stories very unpalatable. Desiree's Baby, on the other hand, does a wonderful job of attacking those institutions of discrimination and hatred and showing up in a sort of microcosm how absurd a lot of those cruelties were. The reason I'm not reading it is just because I don't have the heart right now. It's way too cruel. And the other story that I just don't have it in me to read right now is The Storm, which is so good and is so full of subtle psychological insights and genuine fire and passion. The problem is that it's portraying the passions just a little too honestly for me to read it on YouTube. There's too much quivering ecstasy this and stroking his muscular that, and I think I would turn pink from embarrassment if I tried to read it out loud. But if I don't have the courage to read it in the 21st century, imagine the courage she had to publish it in the 19th. And it's really good, The Storm. Go read it. Instead, I want to wrap up with two much shorter stories, almost vignettes, almost tone poems that, nobody told me there are some stories you appreciate so much more in middle age than you would have in earlier adulthood. The night came slowly. I'm losing my interest in human beings, in the significance of their lives and their actions. Someone has said it is better to study one man than 10 books. I want neither books nor men. They make me suffer. Can one of them talk to me like the night, the summer night, like the stars or the caressing wind? The night came slowly, softly, as I lay out there under the maple tree. It came creeping stealthily from out of the valley, thinking I did not notice. And the outlines of trees and foliage nearby blended in one black mass, and the night came stealing out from them too, and from the east and west, until the only light in the sky, filtering through the maple leaves, and a star looking down through every cranny. The night is solemn, and it means mystery. Human shapes flitted by like intangible things. Some stole up like little mice to peep at me. I did not mind. My whole being was abandoned to the soothing and penetrating charm of the night. The katydids began their slumber song. They are at it yet. How wise they are. They do not chatter like people. They tell me only, sleep, sleep, sleep. The wind rippled the maple leaves like little warm love thrills. Why do fools cumber the earth? It was a man's voice that broke the necromancer's spell. A man came today with his Bible class. He is detestable with his red cheeks and bold eyes and coarse manner and speech. What does he know of Christ? Shall I ask a young fool who was born yesterday and will die tomorrow to tell me things of Christ? I would rather ask the stars. They've seen him. And just one more story. Let me find it. Ripe figs. Maman Nain said that when the figs were ripe, Babette might go to visit her cousins down on the Bayou La Fourche where the sugarcane grows. Not that the ripening of figs had the least thing to do with it, but that is the way Maman Nain was. It seemed to Babette a very long time to wait, for the leaves upon the trees were tender yet, and the figs were like little hard green marbles. But warm rains came along, and plenty of strong sunshine, and though Maman Nain was as patient as the statue of La Madone, and Babette as restless as a hummingbird, the first thing they both knew, it was hot summertime. Every day Babette danced out to where the fig trees were in a long line against the fence. She walked slowly beneath them, carefully peering between the gnarled, spreading branches. But each time she came disconsolate away again. What she saw there finally was something that made her sing and dance the whole long day. When Maman Nain sat down in her stately way to breakfast the following morning, her muslin cap standing like an aureole about her white placid face, Babette approached. She bore a dainty porcelain platter which she set down before her godmother. It contained a dozen purple figs, fringed about with their rich green leaves. "Ah," said Maman Nain, arching her eyebrows, "how early the figs have ripened this year." "Oh," said Babette, "I think they have ripened very late." "Babette," continued Maman Nain as she peeled the very plumpest figs with her pointed silver fruit knife, "you will carry my love to them all down on Bayou La Fourche, and tell your Tante Frosine that I shall look for her at Toussaint, when the chrysanthemums are in bloom."